Hello. Mediumship falls into two broad categories, either mental or physical. If it's mental, everything that is heard, seen, felt, sensed occurs in the medium's own persona, in the mind of the medium and the auric body. If it's physical, then everyone in the room sees, hears, and is able maybe to feel the spirit people. Now, I've studied spiritualism for more than 30 years, and I've experienced mental mediumship as a practitioner and a witness to readings, and also I've sat in physical circles. Here's my report of a physical circle undertaken by the medium David Thompson. Now, David is a very lovely man. He came across on the day of the particular seance as very amenable. I really enjoyed his company and I really enjoyed his work. So David Thompson, an English person living in Australia and touring Britain with these seances back in 2013. And this one took place in Oswestry on the 8th of November 2013. I was also the invigilator, which meant that I was the one who tied and restrained David into the chair at the seance. So here we go. This is my report. Our party of 6 arrived in 2 tranches. The first 3 arrived early. The remainder were late due to a car crash, which blocked their route. The seance start was delayed for theirs and 2 others' late arrival due to this event. The venue was a privately owned property deep in the Shropshire countryside, which had formerly been a farm. The facilities for this event were converted from a former cowshed and comprised an entrance lobby. Shoes were taken off and left there, with adjoining ladies' loo, reception room, which could comfortably seat 30 persons, a small kitchenette off this room, and off the other side, the seance room. The seance room could seat 30 people around 3 walls, facing the 4th wall of a separate room. It was empty of everything except chairs around the 3 walls, 1 door, 1 curtained window, and the cabinet. The room was carpeted and had 4 wall lights, 3 with bulbs in. There was no ceiling, the room being open to the roof, a large A-frame rafter across the centre of the space. A 5-foot by 4-foot sheet of plywood was placed about 4 foot in front of the cabinet to act as a sounding board. The pre-seance talk was given in the reception room by a Silver Cord Circle UK associate member, and all persons connected with David and the property owner were introduced. Security protocols were outlined and a typical seance described. Potential hazards, especially to the medium, were also described, together with do's and don'ts. Invigilators were chosen by Christine Thompson, circle leader, and I was the chosen male. I had not met or communicated with anyone connected to this event, other than my own 6-person group before the event. Security measures. David was first in the room, followed by myself, to be patted down by way of search. Plus, I swept him with a metal detector. I was skilled at patting down, having been trained as such for my job as steward in the then Millennium Stadium, Principality Stadium, Cardiff. Christine and my female counterpart were next in. The female invigilator searched Christine, and vice versa. We then had time to examine the room, and watch every subsequent sitter, including those with the silver cord circle, be searched and directed to a seat by David. No shoes were allowed in the room, and whatever a person was wearing, such as a jumper or cardigan, had to stay in place regardless of any heat discomfort throughout the seance. We inspected the cabinet, which was 2 sides and a roof, of 1 centimetre thick plyboard construction, affixed to the wall opposite the door, using the wall as the cabinet rear. The cabinet was about 6 feet in height and 3 feet in depth, and finished with a pair of black curtains to close off the open front when drawn. The cabinet was painted inside and out in matte black paint, and its floor was simply the carpet of the room. The medium's chair was of wooden construction in the style of a dining room chair, 4 legs and 2 arms, wider than normally encountered in typical homes. We examined the chair for solidity and underneath it, using a torch. Cable ties had been securely attached using strong black tape to the ends of the chair arms, and leather buckle straps were similarly attached to the 2 front legs. I also lifted up the soundboard of similar plyboard as the cabinet, but unpainted, to ensure that there was nothing underneath. The objects to be used in the seance were inspected, including the recording device, which was a CD player. There was a bell, a harmonica, a small bugle-like musical instrument, a torch with a red filter, ping-pong-sized ball painted in luminous paint, a luminous plaque about 5 inches square, and a trumpet. The trumpet and ball were stored in velvet bags, which were turned inside out when examined. I then searched all the sitters of the silver cord circle and the owner of the property using the patting down method, including collars, waistbands, pockets, and trouser legs. As I said earlier, I'm trained to do this as a safety steward at the then Millennium Stadium. I searched David using the same method. David was the only person present wearing shoes, to protect his feet in case spirit people lifted him in the chair from the cabinet to be dropped outside it. Both shoes were taken off and inspected inside and out. The chair was then placed in the cabinet. A woolen cardigan was examined and put on by David to be buttoned up at the front. Strapping to the chair was undertaken at the wrists and ankles, using the straps attached to the chair legs and nylon buckle straps at the wrists inserted in the already attached cable tie loops. Cable ties were selected by the invigilators from supplies. I selected 7 long ties. The balance in the supply kits were removed from the room. Selecting 1 tie at random, I pulled it all the way through and tried to reopen it unsuccessfully. Small cable ties were inserted through the nylon buckle straps to prevent unbuckling of these. 5 of my 6 long cable ties were also inserted through both sides of the cardigan front, sewing, as it were, the sides together. A gag, which was a velvet scarf, was placed around David's head, cutting deep into his mouth and tightly knotted at the rear. My final tie was tightened around the knot. That's the cable tie. Finally, the excess part of each tie was cut off, and I retained the cutter in my pocket until needed again at the end. The small recording device was switched on and placed near David's feet. I think you'll agree they were very robust security measures taken. The seance. The seance was about to begin, and the curtains were closed on David in the cabinet. The bulbs were removed from the 3 wall lights, and Christine guided the circle member to his seat with her small torch. After the last bulb was removed, Christine sat in the chair in the left-hand corner, nearest the cabinet, from David's viewpoint. My seat was immediately to her left. Before Christine seated herself, she heard a voice from the cabinet. Spoke to David to say that the 3 bulbs had been removed, and we all heard his grunt because of the gag. In response, Christine pointed out that the clear voice heard before David's acknowledgement was the voice of William, the control guide. This was before David was entranced. I couldn't say I clearly heard a voice from the cabinet at that point, as I wouldn't have recognised the guide, but others said they heard him, and evidence would be held on the recording device. Christine wore a small, faint red light-emitting device to mark her location to the sitters. The first of 3 to 4 songs were played loudly on the CD player, and we were all encouraged to join in by singing along, whilst David slipped into trance. After the singing, we were greeted by William, the control guide, who then stepped out of the cabinet and walked into the room. The evidence for this being the sound of his footsteps across the plywood on the floor and the sound of his voice moving around. The voice seemed to be at the mouth height for a tall person, and David is a short person, and was distinctive, of very good volume, crisp and clear, yet sounding like a cultured older man. This was in perfect darkness, so perfect you could only see the red dot on Christine's person and any luminous article. You could see nothing else. After moving around the room, William wished to greet the female invigilator and did so by walking over to her. She was seated directly opposite myself. He asked if he could put his hand on her head and was allowed to do so. Christine asked if she could describe what was taking place, which she did. William then came over to me and repeated the introduction and request. I felt a large pad of a hand be gently placed on the front part of my head and rock backwards and forwards slightly, with large fingertip-like sensations, touching the circumference of my skull. This was in pitch blackness, yet the hand had no problem in finding my head whatsoever. William moved around the room and touched others in the same way, also inviting questions to be asked of him. His answers to these were of a high standard philosophically, spiritually, and seemed to please the questioner and interest the neutral listener. I do not intend to report what was said, as a transcript of the dialogue can be obtained via the recording device. His voice was always consistently at the same approximate height, intonation, and character, and his detailed explanation of the use of ectoplasm was particularly informative. The next change came from William when he came towards Christine and questioned her as to specific events surrounding the Thompsons' visit and stay at a convent in Perth, Western Australia. Firstly, he questioned whether or not Christine had packed a couple of suitcases to come to Europe, and if she knew exactly what had been packed. She had done so, and had unpacked and repacked them more than once since arriving here. William drew out of her memory information about humorous events at the convent, when Christine said that he was alluding to youngsters putting plastic insects in their beds to cause mayhem at bedtime. The strange thing being that the youngsters were adamant that they had put them in both beds, yet only the ones in Christine's were discovered. As far as she knew, Christine said that the fake insects were left behind in Australia. When the singing was performed, the circle members were not required to hold hands either side, but whenever a spirit was present, each person was required to hold the hand of his or her neighbour on both sides. William instructed Christine to move my hand with her own forwards and approached us. Christine's left hand was smaller than my right, and her palm was slightly at my right wrist, leaving the last joint of all my fingers and right thumb free. Her right hand gripped my right arm at the elbow. William made a sound like retching, ahead and slightly above our hands. The sound was similar to all sounds said by the silver cord circle to be the spirit entering or leaving ectoplasm, which were heard throughout the seance. Christine took the sound to be the same as when an apport had occurred in the past. At the culmination of the sound, I felt what seemed like very large fingers touch the back of my hand, and almost simultaneously, something like a bar was pressed between my right index finger and thumb, which I then gripped. In fact, two small and light objects were placed into our joined hands. I said when I felt the bar, "I hope he hasn't coughed up his false teeth." After depositing the apport, William suggested Christine check what they were, and she identified them as the very same plastic insects of the kind placed in her bed in the convent in Perth. This brought what seemed to me as an observer to be genuine emotion to Christine. After William returned to the cabinet, more songs were played loudly and with accompanying singing. More ectoplasmic sounds brought forth a smaller voice introduced as Tim. Later explanations had it that this spirit was that of a child who died around 1909, aged about 9, and who had been a street urchin living in London. Tiny in size compared with a fit and healthy 9-year-old of today. Again, Tim had a unique and vibrant voice and was capable of lively banter, the voice being at a low height. Early on, Tim left the cabinet and moved around. He asked for the luminous ball to be produced by Christine from its pouch and given to the female sitting to my left, a lady from my own group, from whom he would pick it up. The ball was held up on the palm of the lady's right hand, and, at one point, its light was briefly completely covered. Christine said she saw Tim's slight fingers at that point. I could only attest to the extinguishing of the luminous effect. Tim took the ball from the hand and walked with it, and went from person to person around the room, with each person saying out loud what they could see, and most, if not all, said they could see small fingers. Finally, the ball was brought back to the lady next to me, and this time, in the exchange, I could clearly see small, thin fingers holding it. Next, Tim asked for the trumpet to be placed in front of the cabinet. Christine removed the trumpet from its velvet bag and took it a few steps in the direction of the cabinet front. She had difficulty finding her way back to her seat and walked into me. The trumpet was then picked up or levitated and swished around at an extreme speed, not once hitting the beam or cabinet unintentionally. Patterns of light from the luminous tape at its wide end were exquisite. The display lasted minutes and the speed did not abate, except for twice when the trumpet was purposefully rapped against the beam and then again against the cabinet roof. On two further occasions, the trumpet was directed at high speed towards my immediate neighbour's face, only to suddenly be stopped just short. Alarming and fascinating in equal measure in the pitch black. Tim may have returned the trumpet to Christine. Wasn't sure about that. Tim returned to the cabinet, and part of his banter from the direction of the front edge of the cabinet alluded to the possibility of a relative of someone present being allowed to enter ectoplasm and speak with the relative in the room. There was a chat between Tim and someone else in the cabinet, clearly behind Tim, with the second voice being indistinct to my hearing. Maybe the recorder picked it up. Tim came back strongly to say he had a Jackie who wanted to step into the room. A couple of persons present said they had lost a relative named Jackie. This Jackie was a Scotsman, and he was welcomed by a female Scot in the room. More ectoplasmic noises and a Scottish accent was heard talking at an average height as he walked into the room and towards the Scottish lady away to my left against the opposite wall, still in the pitch black. There ensued a conversation between the two, and the lady confirmed recognition of the voice and personal detail. The distinctive accent was a voice which was weaker and not as clear as the two former spirit voices, yet could clearly be heard to walk through the room. Before returning to the cabinet, the lady stated that her Uncle Jackie had held her head on both sides simultaneously. After Jackie, the famous singer Louis Armstrong, another regular attendee of David's seances from the spirit side, was introduced, and he came out of the cabinet and walked forward singing. We were asked not to join in during the first song, but were allowed to do so and did so for the second. The clarity was very good, with some distortion because of working through ectoplasm. Louis did not say much, but walked around the room when singing, his voice at the height for a tall man. One of my group testifies that in a previous seance he attended, Louis spoke with a fan of his. Louis asked for the harmonica, which was held out by Christine. His playing of the instrument was exceptional, and he played 2 long renditions before returning the harmonica to Christine. William's voice came back in exactly the same intonation and clarity as before to close the evening. He invited Christine and invigilators to inspect David in the cabinet. We were taken forward using the torch with its red filter. The curtains were drawn back, and we clearly saw David strapped in the chair. We closely examined his gag, wrists, and ankle ties, and to confirm they were as last seen before the start of the seance. The cardigan, which had been sewn together with cable ties, was now seen to be worn back to front. Still, with cut-off cable ties attached. We were returning to our seats when there was a clear and distinct comment made by William from the cabinet. And you should note that was immediately after seeing David gagged. Closing songs were played on the CD player. During one of these, there was a very loud noise, like a heavy weight dropped from height onto the soundboard. When the music was over, we were told that David would need time to return from trance. And after an interlude, Christine stepped forward with the torch and invited my co-invigilator and myself, in white light of the torch, to inspect David again. He was now positioned out of the cabinet, still strapped in the chair in the middle of the soundboard, and this movement was the obvious cause of the recent loud noise. As the bulbs in the lights were being replaced, the cable ties were cut and the gag and straps removed, releasing David. He was calm and was without any signs of exertion. That's an important point to counter any accusation of fraud. His cheeks were indented by the gag for some time afterwards. The plastic insects were examined in full light. One was like a centipede, the other like a large cockroach, both about 3 inches in length. After the séance, there were refreshments taken in the other room and easy conversation with Silver Cord Circle members, and Christine available to answer any question. David needed some peace and quiet for most of this time, but was in the room and did converse with some present. I will testify that the events detailed and descriptions of what I saw and heard are true and to the best of my knowledge. My recall of what was actually said by spirit persons is not likely to be as accurate as would be required for evidence in a court of law. For this, the recording should be heard. As an invigilator, all I would change would be to check under every sitter's chair before the séance, and to write down the order of black versus white or clear cable ties used to sew up David's cardigan and restraints. But the latter of that point wouldn't even have occurred to me if purely black or white ties had been provided. They both were, which clearly shows honesty on the part of the Silver Cord Circle. I'm Paul Challenger, and that is my testimony on the séance of David Thompson, 2013.